Halo Combat Evolved has now been released 3 different times. There's the original from 2001, the anniversary version from 2011, and now 25 years later, Halo Studio has rebuilt the entire campaign again in Unreal Engine 5. And honestly, before we even get into whether the game is good, there is one fairly obvious question. Did Halo really need another remake? Because Combat Evolved is not some forgotten game that became impossible to access. You can still play the original campaign today, and despite its age, a surprising amount of it still works. The weapons feel distinct, the enemies react to what you do, and even fairly simple firefights can play out differently depending on what you pick up or which enemies you decide to deal with first. Campaign Evolved updates almost everything around that foundation. It looks completely different. The movement is faster, there are more weapons and vehicles, and Halo Studios has even added 3 new missions set before the original campaign, but that also creates a slightly strange situation. The best parts of this remake are usually the parts that remind you of how good the original Halo already was. And some of its weakest moments arrive when it tries a little too hard to make that game feel modern. So rather than just asking whether Campaign Evolved is good, I think the more interesting question is what this remake actually improves, and what gets lost when you rebuild a classic that never really stopped working. It's easy to look back at the original Halo and focus on what it did for console shooters. The 2-weapon limit, regenerating shields, grenades on a separate button, and controls that made aiming with an analog stick feel natural. A lot of this became so normal that it's difficult to imagine how different it felt in 2001, but I do not think those individual features are the main reason Combat Evolved still works. The important part is how simple systems constantly interact with each other. An elite can push towards you while grunts scatter behind them. A jackal forces you to change position, and suddenly you are trying to find a plasma weapon because the assault rifle you entered the room with is no longer the right tool. Nothing there is especially complicated on its own. The game just combines those parts well enough that you're rarely doing the exact same thing for very long. The enemy AI is still a huge part of it. Elites dodge grenades, retreat when their shields break, and occasionally rush you when they think they have an advantage. Grunts panic when their leader dies, while hunters turn what initially looks like a straightforward fight into something where positioning actually matters. Reviewers have consistently highlighted this behavior as one of the reasons the campaign remains entertaining after 25 years, and this is also why Halo's larger encounters still feel so good. The game gives you a group of enemies, a few weapons, and an area large enough to move around in. It does not need to tell you what exactly to do next. Maybe you take the Warthog and drive directly into everything. Maybe you stay at a distance until the elites are gone, or maybe your original plan falls apart within 5 seconds and you spend the rest of the fight surviving with 2 plasma pistols because that is all you could find. That unpredictability is still Halo's biggest strength. It is not really about having endless options, it's about giving the player a small collection of useful tools and allowing the situation to change around them. And thankfully, Campaign Evolved mostly understands that. The most obvious change is the presentation. The entire campaign has been rebuilt in Unreal Engine 5 with new environments, animations, sound design, and fully remade cinematics. This is not like the anniversary version where new graphics were placed over the original game and could be switched off anytime. Campaign Evolved is a complete reconstruction. In some areas, the difference is genuinely impressive. The arrival on the Halo ring still has the same basic impact, but there is far more detail in the environment. The forests feel denser, Covenant interiors are more elaborate, and the flood sections are able to lean much further into horror. You can argue that the original's empty spaces were partly caused by technical limitations, but those spaces also created a very particular atmosphere. Sprint was always going to be controversial because Halo fans have somehow managed to turn running slightly faster into one of the longest arguments in gaming. But here, I don't think it destroys the game. The original encounters are still recognizable, and Halo Studios has adjusted parts of the level design around the decreased movement speed. You reach certain positions more quickly, but the combat still asks you to stop, look at what's happening, and choose how you want to engage. The developers have said they specifically work to prevent Sprint from unintentionally breaking the original encounter design. The larger arsenal also adds some welcome variety. There is something strange about seeing weapons from later games appear in Combat Evolved, and purists will probably avoid some of them entirely, but they create new combinations without completely replacing the original sandbox. And because Halo already limits you to 2 weapons, every addition still requires a choice. You cannot carry everything. You have to decide whether the new weapon is actually more useful than the shotgun you know will become important 5 minutes later. That feels like an extension of Halo rather than a complete rewrite of it. The larger issue is not whether the new mechanics function, most of them do. The issue is that Campaign Evolved does not always know the difference between updating the original and trying to make it look like a modern blockbuster. Combat Evolved was surprisingly quiet in places. There were long periods where Master Chief barely spoke, Cortana provided only the information you needed, and the game allowed the environment to establish the tone. You would leave a damaged escape pod, look up and see the ring curving above you. The game did not need 5 minutes of dialogue explaining that the location was important. You could already tell. Campaign Evolved adds more cinematic presentation around these moments. The cutscenes are longer, the characters are more expressive, and the story spends more time trying to build emotional context. Some of that works. Captain Keyes and the Marines feel more like actual people, and the new animation allows the performances to carry more detail. But on the other hand, it can also slow down the campaign that originally moved forward with very little hesitation. Some even specifically criticized the additional cutscenes interrupting the pace and replacing the original's immediate opening with something more heavily directed. The visual direction creates a similar problem. The new version is undeniably more detailed, but detail and atmosphere are not always the same thing. The original Covenant spaces were strange because they were so clean and empty. The lighting was simple, the colors were bold, and there was something slightly uncomfortable about moving through these enormous structures without understanding who built them. The remake occasionally explains too much through visual detail. Everything looks impressive, but some areas feel more familiar because modern games have trained us to expect this kind of dense environmental design. That is the difficult part of remaking an older game. The original's limitations became part of its identity. Removing those limitations does not automatically preserve the feeling they created. The biggest completely new addition is Operation Meteorite. This is a 3-mission story set 1 year before Combat Evolved, with Master Chief and Sergeant Johnson infiltrating a Covenant research vessel. It introduces environments, enemies, and story material that did not exist in the original game, and on paper this is probably the most important part of the entire remake. The original campaign already exists in 2 other forms. Operation Meteorite is Halo Studios' opportunity to show what it can create rather than what it can preserve. The missions are enjoyable. The Covenant ship gives the combat a tighter and more enclosed structure, while the addition of brutes and other elements from later games creates encounters that are impossible in the original campaign. There are some great firefights here, especially when the game puts different enemy types together and gives them enough room to surround you, but the missions also feel slightly cautious. They use modern assets and ideas from across the series, but they rarely take a risk that makes them feel like the beginning of a completely new direction. The story mainly strengthens the relationship between Chief and Johnson, while introducing material that appears more relevant to Halo 2 than the campaign you're about to play. Multiple people has voiced their opinion with the addition of some missions, saying that they found the missions entertaining but less memorable than the original levels, saying that the emotional part of the story never fully lands, and that leaves me with mixed feelings. I like that they are here. They make the package more substantial and give returning players something they have not already completed several times. But this is also the first original campaign content released under the Halo Studios name. I wanted it to tell us more about what the studio's own version of Halo might look like. Instead, it mostly shows that the team can create more content that fits safely around the past. That's not necessarily a bad start, it's just not a very revealing one. While Campaign Evolved modernizes a lot, it remains extremely faithful to the original campaign structure. That means it also brings back some of the original's weaker parts. The second half still reuses environments from earlier missions. Several interior areas repeat the same rooms and corridors, something so closely that it becomes difficult to know whether you're moving forward or accidentally returning to somewhere you have already been. The library is still the library. It looks better, the Flood are more threatening, and the remake adds navigational help, but it remains a long sequence of similar corridors filled with waves of enemies. The new presentation can make the atmosphere stronger, but it cannot completely hide how repetitive the underlying mission is. And honestly, this is where the remake's faithfulness becomes slightly frustrating. Halo Studios was willing to change the weapons, movement, and cinematic. It added vehicle hijacking and expanded parts of the environments. But when it came to some of the campaign's oldest structural problems, the team became much more conservative. I do understand why. Changing the library too much and people will complain that it's no longer the library. Keep it mostly the same and people will complain that you remade a famously repetitive mission without properly fixing it. There is probably no version of this project that avoids that argument. Still, a remake should have the freedom to improve parts of the game that clearly has not aged well as the rest. Campaign Evolved occasionally feels caught between wanting to preserve history and wanting to justify its own existence. It does enough to be different, but it's sometimes reluctant to make the changes that would matter most. The other obvious problem is that Campaign Evolved does not include competitive multiplayer. You can play the campaign alone, with 2 friends locally on consoles, or with up to 4 players online, but there are no traditional competitive maps or matchmaking modes. For a game specifically called Campaign Evolved, that is not exactly hidden. Still, it makes the package feel incomplete. Combat Evolved was not only important because of its campaign, the multiplayer was a huge part of why people spent so much time on it, especially when 4 controllers, 1 television, and a complete lack of personal space were considered a normal evening. A full multiplayer remake would obviously have required a much larger project. It would also risk dividing the current Halo base between yet another set of maps and systems, but without it, the standard price of around $50 become hard to ignore. For someone playing through Game Pass, the value question is fairly simple. You get a polished campaign, new content, and a version that is easy to play with friends across different platforms. For someone buying it separately, the answer depends on how much you value this specific campaign. If you have never played Halo before, this is probably the easiest entry point, but if you already own the Master Chief Collection and mainly want to revisit the original, the remake needs to offer more than upgraded graphics to justify buying it again. I'm not completely convinced that it does. Campaign Evolved is probably the best version for someone experiencing Halo for the first time. The controls are familiar, the visuals are modern, and cross-platform co-op makes it easy to play with other people. It includes more weapons, the new missions, and enough optional modifiers to make repeat playthroughs more varied. But I don't think that automatically makes it the definitive version. The original still has a cleaner atmosphere, its pacing is faster, and the simple presentation allows the ring to feel stranger than it sometimes does here. Campaign Evolved gives you more detail. The original often gives you more space to take the world in, and this is why I don't think one version completely replaces the other. The remake is more accessible and has more content. It is also the version I would probably recommend to someone who does not have any attachment to how Halo looked in 2001. But for returning players, Campaign Evolved feels less like a replacement and more like another interpretation. It is a very polished way to revisit the campaign. It is not the only way the campaign should be remembered. So, did Halo really need another remake? Probably not. The original was already available and the anniversary version had already given people a modernized way to experience it. But I'm still glad Campaign Evolved exists. It proves that the foundation of Combat Evolved is strong enough to survive another generation of changes. The combat is still responsive, the enemy behavior remains more interesting than in a lot of modern shooters, and the larger encounters still create the kind of unscripted moments Halo has always been good at. The remake improves the controls, expands the sandbox, and gives new players a much easier way into the series. It also occasionally misunderstands the value of what it is rebuilding. The added cinematic slowdown moments that once worked because of their simplicity. The more detailed environments can lose some of the original atmosphere, and the parts that genuinely needed deeper changes are often the parts that Halo Studios treated most carefully. Then there is the lack of competitive multiplayer, which makes this feel like a very complete remake of half of Combat Evolved. Campaign Evolved is good because Halo was already good. That might sound obvious, but it's also the remake's biggest problem. Every time the game works, it reminds you of how much Bungie got right 25 years ago, and every time it struggles, it usually comes from trying to modernize something that did not really need fixing. So no, I don't think this is the definitive version of Halo, but it is a good version. For new players, it's probably the best place to start. For returning players, it is an interesting way to see a familiar campaign through a different lens. And maybe that's enough, because after 25 years, the most surprising thing about Campaign Evolved is not how much Halo Studios has changed, it is how little the original game needed to change in order to remain worth playing.